On the island of Crete, sometime around 2000 BCE, a civilization emerged that would later astonish the world simply by being found. The Palace of Knossos, with its labyrinthine corridors, its multi-story construction, its sophisticated plumbing and drainage, its walls covered in vivid frescoes of bull leapers and dolphin swimmers, and women in elaborate flounced skirts, was, when Arthur Evans excavated it beginning in 1900, a revelation so unexpected that Evans himself coined a new name for the culture he had uncovered. He called them the Minoans, after the legendary King Minos, and the name stuck, filling the gap left by a civilization that had left no readable texts and no name for itself that anyone had yet recovered. The Minoans were not just unexpected. They were unlike anything else in the Bronze Age Aegean world. Their art was naturalistic and joyful in ways that Egyptian and Mesopotamian art were not. Their architecture was domestic and labyrinthine, rather than monumental and hierarchical. Their apparent social organization, suggested by the prominence of women in the frescoes and the absence of obvious military iconography, seemed to some scholars to represent something genuinely different from the warrior-priest kingdoms that dominated the surrounding ancient world. The Minoans became, in the popular and academic imagination, the first Europeans, the ancestors of everything that would follow in the Western tradition. But who were they actually? Where did they come from? These questions haunted Aegean archaeology from the moment of Evans's first excavation, and for a century, without direct genetic evidence, they generated more heat than light. In 2013, that changed. The debate about Minoan origins before the DNA evidence was organized around two broad positions. The first, associated with Arthur Evans himself, and with a long tradition of Aegean scholarship, proposed that the Minoans were indigenous to Crete or had migrated from the broader Anatolian and Near Eastern world, carrying with them the agricultural traditions and the urban complexity that would eventually produce the palace civilization. This model placed the Minoans within the general story of the Neolithic expansion from the Near East into the Mediterranean, as one expression of the same process that had brought farming and eventually civilization to Europe from the East. The second position, popular especially in the early 20th century, proposed that the Minoans had come from Africa, specifically from Egypt, or from the broader northeastern African world, citing certain stylistic similarities in Minoan art to Egyptian art, and arguing that the sophistication of Minoan civilization was more plausibly explained by African than by European or Anatolian origins. This position was never entirely mainstream but had persistent advocates and connected to broader arguments about the African origins of Mediterranean civilization that were particularly charged in the context of the racial politics of 20th century scholarship. Neither position had direct genetic evidence to support it. Both were argued primarily from material culture, from artistic styles, from architectural comparisons, from the circumstantial evidence of what the Minoans built and painted and left behind. The writing system that the Minoans used, known as Linear A, has never been deciphered, which meant that even the internal evidence that written records might have provided was unavailable. The Minoans could not speak for themselves in any language that modern scholarship could read. The 2013 study published in Nature Communications, led by researcher George Stamatoyamopoulos and a team from the University of Washington, working with mitochondrial DNA, extracted from ancient Minoan skeletal remains, recovered from a Bronze Age cave burial site on Crete, gave the first direct molecular evidence of who the Minoans actually were. The study analyzed mitochondrial DNA from ancient Minoan individuals and compared it against a comprehensive reference panel of modern and ancient populations from across Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. The results were unambiguous in their broad outlines. The Minoan mitochondrial profiles clustered most closely with ancient and modern European populations, particularly with populations from Western and Northern Europe and from the Caucasus region. They showed no significant clustering with Egyptian or sub-Saharan African populations, and they showed strong similarities to the ancient Anatolian farmer populations, whose expansion into Europe is now understood to have been the primary vehicle for the spread of agriculture and eventually urban civilization across the continent. In plain terms, the ancient Minoans were European, or more precisely, they were the product of the same Anatolian farming population expansion that had already transformed most of the rest of Europe. They were not Egyptians. They were not Africans in any meaningful genetic sense. They were, genetically, closely related to the people who had been farming in Europe for thousands of years before the palace civilization of Crete emerged. This finding had significant implications for the ongoing debate about the origins of European civilization. The Minoans had long been positioned as either a bridge between the Near East and Africa and the emergence of European civilization, or as an exotic import from outside the European genetic world. The 2013 study placed them firmly within the European genetic landscape as the descendants of the same Anatolian farmers whose genetic legacy is the foundation of modern European populations from Spain to the Caucasus. But the story did not end with the 2013 study. In 2017, a much larger and more comprehensive ancient DNA study of the Aegean Bronze Age was published in the journal Nature, led by researchers including David Reich at Harvard and Iosif Lazaridis, analyzing genomes from ancient Minoans and Mycenaeans alongside a broader reference panel of ancient and modern populations. This study had significant advantages over the 2013 work. It used whole genome data rather than just mitochondrial DNA. It included both Minoan and Mycenaean individuals, and it was able to address not just the question of Minoan origins, but the question of the relationship between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, the mainland Greek Bronze Age culture that would eventually succeed them. The 2017 study confirmed the basic finding of 2013. The ancient Minoans showed ancestry primarily derived from Anatolian farmers, with additional contributions from ancient populations of the Caucasus and the broader Western Eurasian world. They had no significant ancestry from Egypt or sub-Saharan Africa. In this respect, the 2013 findings held up. The more interesting finding of the 2017 study was the comparison between Minoans and Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans, the Bronze Age Greeks of the mainland who would eventually produce Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and whose culture is the direct ancestor of classical Greek civilization, showed a genetic profile similar to the Minoans, but with an additional component. They had Anatolian farmer ancestry in common with the Minoans, but they also carried a proportion of ancestry related to the ancient populations of the Eurasian steppe, the same ancestry that had already swept across most of Europe in the Bronze Age, in association with the spread of Indo-European languages. This difference between Minoans and Mycenaeans is genomically small, but historically enormous. It suggests that the Mycenaeans were the product of a mixing between the Anatolian farmer-derived population that had produced the Minoans and an incoming steppe population, probably speaking an early form of Greek, that arrived on the Greek mainland during the Middle Bronze Age. The Minoans, who remained on Crete and whose palace civilization continued through most of the 2nd millennium BCE, appear to have had significantly less contact with this incoming steppe population. They were, in genetic terms, more purely the heirs of the original Anatolian farmer expansion, while the Mycenaeans were a hybrid of that ancient agricultural heritage and the newer steppe ancestry. This finding illuminates something important about the relationship between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans that the archaeological record had long hinted at. The Mycenaeans eventually absorbed or displaced the Minoan civilization. The Palace of Knossos shows evidence of Mycenaean occupation and control in its final phase, around 1450 BCE, and the Linear B script that the Mycenaeans used, which has been deciphered and shown to be an early form of Greek, replaced the undeciphered Linear A of the Minoans. Whatever the Minoans were culturally and linguistically, they were not Greek in the way that the Mycenaeans were Greek. The genetic data is consistent with this picture. The Minoans and the Mycenaeans were related but distinct. They shared an Anatolian farmer heritage, but diverged in their subsequent history. The Mycenaeans had incorporated the steppe ancestry and presumably the Indo-European language that came with it. The Minoans had not, or had done so to a much lesser degree. When the Mycenaeans eventually dominated Crete, it was not simply a military conquest. It was, in the genomic reading, a meeting of two populations that had been diverging for centuries, one of which had integrated the steppe component that would eventually make it the ancestor of the Greeks, and one of which had maintained a more purely Anatolian farmer genetic heritage that connected it to the original Neolithic colonization of Europe. Consider what the bull leaper fresco at Knossos means in this context. The young people, male and female, seizing the horns of a charging bull and vaulting over its back, the athleticism and the danger and the apparent ritual significance of the act, the vivid blue sea visible in the background of other frescoes, the natural world rendered with an intimacy an observation that feels startlingly modern, even after 4,000 years. These people, the painter and the bull leaper and the woman in the elegant skirt watching from the side, were the descendants of farmers who had walked out of Anatolia thousands of years before they were born, who had carried their seeds and their animals onto the island of Crete and built, over 2,000 years, the first palace civilization in Europe. They did not know they were the first Europeans. They did not know that their art would be excavated 4,000 years later by a British archaeologist who would name them after a legend. They did not know that their DNA would one day answer the question of where they came from in a way that their own undeciphered writing never could for the scholars who came after them. They knew the bull and the sea and the palace and whatever gods they worshipped in the way that people always know the world they were born into, as simply the world, without the perspective of everything that would come after. The DNA gave them back their place in that story, not as exotic outsiders from Africa or the Near East, whose sophistication was borrowed from elsewhere, not as a mystery population without identifiable genetic kin, but as the descendants of the same agricultural migration that had been slowly building European civilization from its Anatolian origins for thousands of years. The specific and remarkable expression of that process that happened to occur on an island in the southern Aegean, producing something that still astonishes 4,000 years later in the frescoes of Knossos. The Minoans were never what we thought, not because they were alien or exotic or borrowed from outside the European world, but because they were, in the most precise genetic sense, among the most purely European people of the Bronze Age. The first palace civilization of Europe was built by the direct descendants of Europe's first farmers. The continent's oldest urban tradition was an indigenous product of its own deepest agricultural roots. History did not come to Europe from outside. The Minoans show that it grew from within, and the walls of Knossos, still standing after 4,000 years, are the proof. What does it mean that the people who built the first great palace civilization of Europe left no deciphered written record of who they were? The Minoans inscribed linear A on clay tablets, on stone vessels, on palace administrative documents. Those inscriptions are still being studied. Some researchers believe linear A may be a Semitic language, related to the ancient languages of the Near East from which the Minoans' Anatolian farmer ancestors came. Others believe it represents a language isolate, unique to Crete, with no surviving relatives. The question remains open, but the DNA has given us something that the unread text could not. It has placed the Minoans in their biological context, connected them to the migration story that produced them, and shown that the first great European civilization was not an import, but an organic development of the agricultural tradition that the continent's earliest farmers had been building for thousands of years, before Knossos rose above the Cretan plain. The Minoans painted their world in vivid colors on the walls of a palace that archaeologists are still excavating. The frescoes show them as they wanted to be seen, joyful, athletic, connected to the natural world, the women as present and active as the men. The DNA shows them as they were biologically, Anatolian farmer descendants, Aegean island people, the most purely European population of the Bronze Age, building the first chapter of a story that is still being told. Both pictures are true. Together, they are more complete than either would be alone.